Hey, David, good morning. Good morning. So,
Good to see you. Good to see you, Binu.
as we wait for others to join, the today's topic that we selected is a very interesting topic or close to heart topic for many, many, many parents and school authorities equally, because child well-being it's a core of everything that we do. Yeah.
Yeah, it is, Binu. Yeah, and often we have conversations about well-being in education, and often the focus is what happens inside of a school system. But increasingly, we recognise that although families and parents are not in the school building,
Yeah.
they are absolutely part of the school system, and arguably, families and parents, caregivers are the most important partner in this whole process. Obviously, having great leadership in a school is so important for well-being. Having highly trained and effective educators is so important for well-being. Having student programs inside a school that are well-designed and engaging for students is excellent. But it doesn't matter how much the leader or the teacher cares about a child. Almost always, the parent or the carer cares much more about the child than any teacher ever could or any leader ever could, and I see that with my own children who are going to a very, very good elementary primary school here in Melbourne, Australia, and excellent leaders, excellent educators. But then my child comes home to me, and I'm the person that literally brought them into the world, who tucks them in at night, who helps them brush their teeth, who's built, taught them to speak the language they speak, so no one in the world could ever care more about my child. And that's why my skill as a parent has a huge impact on the well-being of a child. And so we have to think about parents as part of the school ecosystem. And that's why we're so passionate about supporting families and parents to learn many of the skills that educators are being exposed to and school leaders are being exposed to and the students themselves are being exposed to in leading schools.
Yeah. Thank you, David. So that is why we selected this topic for Flourishwell's YouTube live series today, supporting child well-being at home. In India, if you consider, there is many at times the children come and tell me my parents didn't love me. And parents tell me, like, no, I don't know why. The kids are not understanding how much sacrifice we make for the children. So it is not because the parents they love the kids so deeply and they often sacrifice
Yeah.
so much for their future, but sometimes even with the best intention many families struggle to understand what children are really going through emotionally. So
Yeah.
it is that they are not lacking love, they're lacking emotionally safe spaces where they can be heard without fear, judgment, comparison. So this is a major concern that I see when I talk to parents and at the same, with the children. So we will explore this some most common issues that parents face at home and how they can provide the best possible way to support their children's well-being.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the conversation, Binu, and I know you bring a huge amount of expertise to this field as well. But I also recognise that neither you nor me are perfect parents, and we certainly don't have all of the answers, and there is no script that we can give to people. Being a parent or a caregiver in 2026 is a very, very difficult job. It's hard. It's the most wonderful job on earth, but it's the hardest
Yeah.
job on earth. We often say teaching is one of the most stressful, most challenging professions on earth, which is true. But I think being a parent or a primary caregiver is harder again. And so this conversation today won't solve all the problems, but I hope we were able to give people some really practical ways to think about the connection with their child, supporting their child, and helping make parenting just a little more fun and a little less difficult, maybe.
Yeah. So I echo with what you said, David, because parenting is the most challenging task, but none of us get any official training to do. The thing is,
Yeah.
none of us are perfect parents, like you said, but we are all doing the best possible way because the core of parenting is love and a sacrificial support for their children because we all want the best out of our children and we want to provide the best for the children. Yeah. So let's start today's conversation. And in the meantime, if anybody wants to ask any questions, please type in the chat and we will try to answer the questions in the best possible way with our knowledge and expertise. We are so happy to have you, David, with us again for this YouTube series. So what do you think? Many parents communicate that there is lack of communication is a major issue that they face. So what do you think about it? Is it the same situation in Australia too? And how do you handle this situation of, it's not like lack of communication means completely shut down. When they need, they talk, and many times they won't communicate everything with the parents, but parents expect the children to communicate everything. So there's a little bit of drift happens in that area.
Yeah, I think just before we go any further, Binu, we also need to, before I answer your question, we need to recognize that every household is different, every child's different, every relationship is different. You know, we're also talking about children, because we kind of have this school framework, education framework, we're really talking about children from the age of 3 years old, maybe in early learning centers, through to 18 or 19 years old at the top end of high school. So when we talk about the parent-child relationship, it's very different, obviously, developmentally for a 3-year-old child compared to a 19-year-old child. So despite those differences, however, there are some fundamental principles that are true in all of those contexts. And I think in terms of this connection or this communication piece, Binu, I think probably the most foundational piece of evidence that we've seen, maybe in all of psychology, or certainly one of the top 10 most important foundational principles of psychology, is that the most basic human need of all is the sense of belonging, right? It's a fundamental, basic psychological need. It's more important to a human than any other psychological need. And, you know, Bowlby's attachment theory shows that, you know, one of the most important theories in psychology shows that secure attachment is the single most robust predictor of adolescent well-being. So if I take an 8-year-old child and all I know about that child is that they have a very secure connection to a parent, I can predict with very high accuracy that they will have a healthy adolescence and a healthy adulthood. This sense of belonging, connection, safety, you know, being able to explore the world from a secure base, that is such a powerful predictor of well-being. And the way that parents intuitively develop that connection is the same way as what the research suggests that we should develop it. And that is that especially when things are difficult, we must maintain this principle of connection before correction. Yeah. Now, I'll say that again. It's connection before correction, because, you know, connection, you know, a child that feels connected, a child that feels safe, a child that feels supported, will accept guidance. They'll accept instruction. They'll accept learning. But a child who feels unseen, well, they're going to fight. You know, if they don't feel they belong, they fight these instructions, and they fight against any development, any kind of guidance that you're offering, even when it makes sense to you, right? So we must connect before we correct. And I think this kind of sits at the heart of a lot of the conflict that we see in elementary, primary schools and in high schools as well, is that, you know, when a child is, you know, misbehaving, and maybe we'll talk about that later, or demonstrating some challenging behaviors, the parent just wants to kind of fix the child or correct them. And that will not work, or it very rarely works, if the child doesn't first feel a deep sense of safety and connection in that conversation, in that household, in that environment. You know, and it's hard as a parent, especially when a child does something that, you know, pushes your buttons or winds you up, or it's a repetitive behavior that you've tried to support the child with a million times. It feels like, you know, you want to just kind of, you know, fix them or change that behavior. But we must force ourselves as adults in this situation to connect before we correct. And what that looks like is often just, you know, managing your own emotions, being willing to acknowledge that, you know, I'm feeling a little bit stressed right now, but I'm going to really force myself to love this child in this moment, to hear their side of the story, to regulate my emotions, so that, you know, whether it's a physical hug or a metaphorical hug that you're giving that child in that situation, whatever's occurring, they feel safe, connected, and they feel a deep sense of belonging first before anything else happens.
Yeah, thanks, David, because that connection before correction is something like a golden rule in parenting. I always say that, you know, that is what we need to follow. But many a times as parents, we fail because that moment of anger, you know, we don't feel like regulating your emotions, because co-regulation is so important to connect with the child.
Yeah.
And when your amygdala is not connecting well with the prefrontal cortex, you are also angry and the child is also upset. And this together actually create that issue. So as parents, we need to remind ourselves constantly that, you know, when the child's brain is totally in that undress, that mood, You cannot, whatever you say, whatever logic you try to impart, that won't work. So we need to calm down, and also we need to regulate the child's emotions. Once the child
Mm,
is back to the normal, connected with the logical brain, you can have that logical conversations. So this is, I as a parent of three kids, I constantly remind myself that, when the child is shouting, you are also raising the voice, it's not going to help.
mm,
Once you come back to the
yeah.
normal mode, when both are like calm down, you can have a conversation. And also, sometimes as parents, we feel like giving a hug to the child, or you understand that the mistake is on your side, just asking, saying a sorry,
Mm,
it's sometimes, it won't go, like, it's little bit hesitation happens that side. Actually, we need to shed all those layers, because ultimately what we need, the well-being of the child. And we all need peace at home. We don't need this constant
mm,
conflict at home. So it's always better
yeah.
to have, like, as adults, we need to be good role models. Talk to the
Yeah.
child, calm them down, and give a hug. And sometimes if we need to say sorry, it's fine, it's your child. It's,
Yeah.
yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
reminding us connection
Yeah.
for
Can I
correct.
just add what can
Yeah.
I add one last thing, Binu, that you made me remember this idea we often talk about of particularly younger children or pre-adolescent or even adolescent children don't have a fully developed emotional center in their brain, right? And so they're trying to manage some big things. A 12-year-old or a 14-year-old child is trying to manage big feelings, big emotions, but they just don't have a fully mature, fully developed capacity to manage those emotions. And so what we see in very effective parenting is that when you sit with the child, the way to think about this is you need to lens them your emotional center, your brain in that moment. So if you can sit with a child who has an underdeveloped, immature emotional center and prefrontal cortex, if they can borrow your brain in that moment and share the resource, then we have the capacity, to move forward together. Because often the child they can't hold the feeling effectively. Adults are very good, or we develop the capacity to manage and hold big feelings. Children aren't as good at doing that. And so the child needs to know that you can hold their feeling for them before you try and change their behavior. So I really love this idea of lending out your emotional and intelligent capacity to a child to help work through it together. It's almost like you're synchronizing, joining your brains together with a little cable and sharing the resource and moving forward together.
Yeah, thanks, David. So another issue that I have noticed is like a difficulty in setting boundaries, because
Yeah.
even if you can handle the conflict, so sometimes to handle the conflict, to encourage that communication, sometimes the parents like give some loose boundaries, like, you
Mm.
can just, it is like very porous. So what do you think? Like sometimes it's too strict and controlling, sometimes it's become too permissive. So what do you think in this
Mm.
type of extreme parenting, how does it affect the well-being of the child?
Yeah. Children don't want uh, complete freedom. That's a very scary scenario for a child. But they also, particularly pre-adolescent, adolescent children, don't want complete constriction, right? It's a little bit like, the homes that we live in. Most of us don't want to live in a palace with a thousand different bedrooms where we can't find each other. And most of us don't want to live in a tiny little shoebox, right? It kind of feels like life's very constricting. Same thing in our workplace, none of us want a job that has no kind of boundaries or restrictions around it. And none of us want a job where we're only allowed to do one thing. Humans have this desire to feel a sense of some level of uh, fencing around our environment, some level of fencing around our social situations, some level that, some sense that there is a world that we can wrap our head around. But we also seek some level of autonomy and independence. And it's such a foundational part of human motivation is the capacity to successfully impact our world or to have agency on our world. And so it's just this balance that it's not just in parenting, it's actually in the as humans try and live a flourishing life, we need to try and get this balance right in all contexts, whether it's at work or home, in relationships, this sense of some level of constriction, but not too much constriction. And so the way, maybe an example that we're seeing a lot of, Binu, and we can't talk about parenting without talking about this, but that's mobile phones and screens, which has become kind of a new landscape and a sense of panic for some parents who just can't seem to get the boundaries right. We have. I think this is maybe a really interesting example for us to talk about, and perhaps the way we think about this is that we've got to avoid moralizing, right? Children don't really respond well to moralizing that's designed to build boundaries. Saying things to children like, you need to be out exploring the world more, or mobile phones are affecting the way humans are developing. That kind of moral stance, whilst important for kids to understand, doesn't really help set effective boundaries. So what we're trying to suggest is that instead of moralizing with a child, we have very clear, rational, co-developed sense of boundaries that are based in logic and based in kind of a positive sense of doing this together. So instead of saying to a child, your phone is the enemy, it's not. The phone isn't the enemy. What's the enemy is a lack of fun or connection or family cohesion or family environment. Or instead of helping kids, instead of trying to limit kids to not using phones at all on a Tuesday or a Friday, we sit down and have a conversation about what does a Tuesday or Friday look like in our household when we're at our best? What does it look like for us as a family when, we're all enjoying this family environment? What does it look like when we're sleeping well and having good attention and having good mood regulation and emotional resilience because we're communicating? Like, what does a good family environment look like, and how can we design the family structure, the family rules, the family regulations, so that we all can experience the best of that? Because phones aren't the enemy, but what John Haidt's work shows really is that displacement is the enemy. It's what phones delete from our life that is the real problem. It's not so much TikTok and Instagram and spending hours on screens that really seems to be the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that we're not out hanging out with people and climbing trees and riding bikes and experiencing the real world. So we want to work with children to develop boundaries that feel like they're co-developed, that have a rational underpinning, but are not based on moralizing, I guess.
To connect with the mobile phone issue at homes, because most of the households now struggle with the mobile phones. I was reading in the newspaper yesterday that late night, the child was around 12-year-old, was playing with the mobile phone. So the mother confiscated the mobile and the child left home at midnight. So they're still searching, I think, as far as I know, the newspaper reported. So it has created like a lot of issues, because more than, these parents are there for me, they love me, they are my everything, has changed to mobile phone. So like displacement, the word that you said, displacement of family time, displacement of relationships. So multiple areas this has affected. So this need like a very intense, because if you see as an easy parenting, I always say that mobile phones are the easiest babysitter. So you displace that parenting with, okay, mother or dad wants to play with their mobile phone, so they will just hand over the mobile phone to the child so that the children won't trouble the parents. So we have to make a conscious decision that, how much time you spend with mobile phones, because if you are spending a lot of time, you cannot advise your child or correct your child and asking the child to remove the mobile phone. So this is actually a big area that all parents need to address on. First, reflect on what is your mobile phones. I myself struggle, because then I feel guilty about it. So we need to have a timing, like, how much time that you spend together as a family. Are you doing the right thing by telling your child not to touch the mobile phone at the same time you are using with it? So there are multiple things involved with that. That's a separate discussion that we need to take it up.
Yeah. No, and we saw, if I give you a very quick example, Binu, in our, just to reflect on what you were saying, we saw that exact scenario unfold in our household. I've got a 10-year-old son and an 8-year-old daughter. And we did have a rule in our family that we had no phones or no devices after dinner time, after we eat a meal together at night. But it sort of worked for a while, but we learned the hard way that we had kind of one rule for the kids and not for the adults. And the kids saw through it straight away. And it wasn't until we made it a family boundary, no devices after dinner for any of us, that it really stuck. And we end up now with no arguments, no negotiations. This is just what we all do now because we want to connect. We're not just trying to ban phones because they're a bad thing. We as a family, we decided to have no phones after dinner in order for us to connect together, to play games, to play cards, to have conversations. So they didn't, my own children didn't need a lecture about blue light or dopamine or the dangers of social media. They just needed to see that we meant it enough to do it for ourselves. So this is, I think, a lesson that I've learned personally in the last couple of months, and I think it's so important. What you're saying is that we co-develop these rules inside of our families that that we deploy with that are co-developed and that have a kind of real rationale linked to a benefit.
Yeah. So I have three kids. My son got his mobile phone when he was at 15. And now he is 20 and he's telling to his sisters that I wish I didn't get the mobile phone at 15 because now I know the bad effects of it. It's like I cannot focus. My attention span is reduced. So that is actually helped me to, regulate this with my little ones. One is 13 and one is going to be 10. So that actually helped me. So my daughter, she doesn't have any social media accounts, no mobile phones. She used laptop only for academic purpose. But the good part is like, the place where I stay, they have a lot of friends. So there is something to replace that with. But if you're living in a small place and you don't have many friends, your life is just, confined to an area, then we actually consciously need to find some activities to enhance the kids. Yeah. So just to connect with that, when we talk about parenting, what do you think from the from what you have seen working with children and parents, like what is something like a global challenge that parents are facing? Yes, first of all, mobile phone addiction is something, and anything else, like what do you say that the parental values, is it conflicting with children's upbringing, or what, you say children not to do this, at the same time parents are doing it or lying in front of the children, so disrespect. So I am seeing the school scenario because the parental behavior that we can see that the same thing that child is mimicking or copying. So what do you think, that is it a challenge that we are facing recently, or it was there before, it's more visible now?
The way, maybe from a really zoomed out level, I'd like to think about this one, Binu, is that parents often hear the word well-being and they think about something they have to deliver to a child or something they have to do for a child, like it's a program or it's a conversation or it's a strategy or it's an app we download or it's a mindfulness program or something. But the shift we're really trying to make with parents we work with is from delivery to environment. It's not about delivering something, it's about the creation of an environment. The home is an ecosystem, right? It's a very complex ecosystem. And the question we want to ask parents and families and caregivers is, what kind of ecosystem are you building? What gets celebrated in your home? What gets ignored? What gets repaired? Because children grow inside of a climate inside of your house. And that's far more impactful than any app or program or strategy or single conversation even. And we see this in the evidence, the scientific literature as well. Bronfenbrenner's bioecological theory is the foundation of the way we think about that. And that is that children are raised or developed in nested systems is the terminology we use, right? But this kind of ecosystem. And the home for a child, for most children, is the most influential of all of these ecosystems. And it significantly impacts their development. So it's this culture, this climate inside of your family that's so important. And as you were suggesting, that's children are wired to mimic, to copy, to embrace the behaviors of trusted adults around them. I mean, that's the incredible power of the human brain as it develops. Is it, it's tabula rasa. It's born effectively pretty blank, with almost no real skills or knowledge or capacities, very few instincts. Humans are born with very few programs built in, and we rapidly learn because of our environment, but mostly because of the trusted adults around us. That's how the human brain learns. And so the ecosystem you're creating as a parent inside of your family is going to massively impact the development of the child. We also see this in the Harvard Adult Development Study, which is the longest study of human happiness ever conducted. And it lands on the same finding, that the quality of relationships in the home environment is the single strongest predictor of adult flourishing, right? I'll say it again. The quality of relationships in the home environment is found to be the single strongest predictor of adult flourishing. It's much more predictive than wealth or education or even genetics, So, across all of psychology, again, we find this, this premise emerging that adults have a huge impact on the way their child is going to evolve based on their own behavior, the culture, the ecosystem they're creating. And so we want to keep asking families this question: what kind of ecosystem are you trying to build?
Yeah, to connect with that, David, do you have any suggestions to build there is no perfect ecosystem?
No.
So is there any suggestions that, some ingredients for this ecosystem where the child will thrive?
Yeah. It's a great question. And as you said, there's no perfect one. And in fact, not only that, there are infinitely variable versions, and each home is different. And we appreciate it. Some families have limited resources. Some families or some children are living in homes where parents are not as available, and they're working multiple jobs, or parents with disabilities themselves. And so, we're talking in a very general sense here. We of course appreciate that some children live in very disadvantaged situations, traumatic situations. However, in most of the schools that we work with, parents do have quite a lot of agency and capacity to shape this ecosystem. So I can't really, the question, I want to sort of flip the question back at you, Binu, and suggest that the way to answer this question, how do we help parents with this, is to just give them time and capacity to tell us how they answer that question. What kind of ecosystem are you trying to build? Paint me the picture of the family that you're trying to create, because every parent that we work with has this kind of image in their head, the vision of their child as they've grown up. I've got my 10-year-old son, and I can imagine him as a 24-year-old kid. And I have this very clear kind of movie in my mind about the type of child I'm trying to produce, the type of values I want to instill in him. Parents have this in their head, but often it kind of gets lost amongst the busyness. And so we want to have this conversation very explicitly with parents, like what kind of child are you trying to bring? What kind of ecosystem are you trying to bring into your family? And from that point, once you give parents the opportunity to take a breath and to articulate that, then we have the ability to build the rules, the regulations, the parameters inside of the family that enable that to become reality. So it's really about answering that question first: what type of family, what type of ecosystem are you trying to build?
So there are 4 words that I always use when I communicate with the parents. Like, your children doesn't need your money and gadgets; they need your love and time.
Yeah.
So when love and time
Yes.
is replaced
Yes.
with money and gadget, we started seeing these problems, because
Yes.
seen, parents competing with each other to give the most modern gadget to the children, and
Yeah.
the best facility to their children. But to that, in that pursuit of that, what they're sacrificing is the time spent with children. Because to make more money, to provide the best available thing, the time, but the children need their time. Just be with them, just play with them, to express love, unconditional love. That
Yeah.
is where the true
Yeah.
change happens. Um,
Yeah.
so this conversation is not just the end; it is just the beginning of parenting. Because parenting, like we mentioned in the beginning, it's the most difficult task, and none of us get any training to do that. And children do not need perfect parents, like David mentioned. They need emotionally available parents who are willing to listen, repair, guide, and grow with them. So in this conversation, David, do you think like anything, because many a times I hear that the parenting was not correct, and that is why the children are like that. There's a direct connection or a correlation making with the parenting and the children. So anything that you want to speak about that concern?
Yeah. There is, as we said earlier, there is a lot of psychological evidence that the environment a child grows up in will affect their adolescent and then their adult life. But we want parents to recognize that probably the biggest myth that we see in parenting, in wellbeing in schools particularly, is that good parents are calm parents. They just aren't. That's just not true. Good parents are parents who are present, as you said, who love their child and who repair. It's not about being a perfect parent. It's about being a parent who can repair, because life's hard. Ruptures happen inside of families, especially families where there's a lot of love and a lot of care, because, I do get frustrated with my children because I love them so much, and I want the best for them. And so sometimes, because I'm human, you make mistakes and the child makes mistakes, and fractures happen inside of families. And our goal isn't to be perfect and to have to have a perfectly calm environment. The goal is to be able to repair. And we see this in the scientific literature, that children don't need calm parents; they need ones that come back, right? To be able to repair the situation, to be able to kind of give their own emotional gift to the child of apologizing. Sometimes this looks like, the next morning saying to a child, look, I'm really sorry, I didn't get that right. Can I have a take two? The way I spoke to you last night, I was frustrated because I was tired. That wasn't me at my best. Do you mind if we do that conversation again? So it's about recognizing as a parent that you are human, that you're raising children inside of an imperfect situation, but we need to be able to repair situations. Probably the most important message I'd like to leave parents with. And if there's one more, Binu, and that's this, and we haven't really covered it today, and that is, I think you and I have actually made this mistake throughout this conversation multiple times. Both you and I have made this mistake that, we're not really raising children. We're in a family. What we're raising is adults.
Yeah.
We're raising young adults. These are children who will become the person that we want them to be. So the question isn't, how do I get my kid to stop doing this thing right now? It's, what's the adult version of this kid going to need, and what am I building towards? So this reframe changes everything, because it takes pressure off the moment and allows us to see the bigger picture. So we really want to encourage parents to stop trying to be perfect in the moment, stop optimizing for the next 10 minutes, and optimize for the next 30 years. The thing that's hardest about parenting is that you're playing a game where the score isn't visible for about 20 years or 20 or 30 years. The work I'm putting into my 8-year-old daughter now, that game that we're playing there, I think I'll probably see the results of that when she's 28, probably in 20 or 30 years. And that's the hardest bit about being a parent, because you put so much into this. It's so hard, and you don't really see the results for maybe decades into the future. And so this idea about just doing your best, being present, loving the child, as you said, being willing to apologize, being mindful of the ecosystem you're creating. And the last thing is, Binu, that, we've worked with thousands of parents around the world. We've got a parenting course called The 7 Habits of Wellbeing Wise Families. We work with families in schools all around the world, and I've never met a perfect parent. I don't think it exists, and I've never met a parent who can do it by themselves. Of course, we recognize there are some families who are disconnected. There are parents who are doing parenting child alone without much support around them, but we do encourage people as best as possible to be vulnerable, to open yourselves up to other people around you, because you can bet that the challenges you're facing in your family are almost the same or very similar to hundreds, maybe thousands of other families that live near you or are part of your school community. So please do, we encourage people to reach out to other families, other parents who almost always want to help you or help others around them.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks, David, for the concluding statement that, parenting is a long-term investment. We need patience, loving, and a caring ecosystem to create good human beings for the society. So it's, that we need to shift our attention from that, this is today's children, it's my children, because we are, like you said, we are preparing adults who are going to contribute to the society. Thank you for this amazing conversation. It's not ending. We will continue. Next Friday, again, we will come back for a conversation on the role of leadership in building well-being at schools. Thank you all for watching us today. We'll see you again next week. Thank you.
Thanks, Binu.